Hey Nintendo fans, and welcome back to part 2 of our 3-part Nintendo Spaceworld saga. While it's true that we could cover nearly every year, show, and game along Nintendo Spaceworld, I've decided to cover 3 specific hardware debuts in Nintendo console history. In part 1, we looked at the very first unveiling of the Nintendo 64 console, and in part 2, I want to talk about one of the most forgotten pieces of Nintendo hardware, the 64DD. Before we get to the main part of the video, the hardware, I want to finish up a few story threads that I left hanging from part 1 with the Nintendo 64 software. The first was Kirby Ball 64. By 1996's Spaceworld show, the game had been polished into a free-moving racer with a familiar name, Kirby's Air Ride. While the objectives weren't completely clear, the game was planned to have race, trick, and floating elements, along with 4-player split-screen multiplayer similar to Mario Kart 64. Development of this game became quiet after the 1996 show, and the game would end up getting announced for the GameCube way later in 2003. I believe it to be one of the GameCube's greatest hidden gems, but it is crazy to think that Kirby Air Ride has roots that go all the way back to one of the very first playable demos on the Nintendo 64. The only thing truly lost in this conversion, though, is an apostrophe S. I have no idea why. The second game that changed from 1995 to 96 was The Legend of Zelda 64. Remember this brown-haired clunker? By the 1996 show, Link much more closely resembled the blonde protagonist that we know from Ocarina of Time today. Gameplay and textures greatly resemble the finished Ocarina of Time product, but 2 major changes are still noticeable. For one, the game only appears to have one button dedicated to items. The reason for this is that second biggest difference. It appeared that this version of Zelda 64 had a free-moving camera, and that's most likely where the C buttons were being used at this time. It was just a small preview, but it had me pumped for the future of Zelda in 3D. Just one thing left me curious though. It appeared that this game would no longer release for the main Nintendo 64 system, but instead as a new add-on, the Nintendo 64DD. At the end of the last episode, I mentioned how media was smitten with the new Nintendo 64 right after its debut. The system specs, graphical quality, and upcoming lineup of key titles looked strong, and a lot of the press already seemed to be writing off the 32-bit Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation consoles in wait for Nintendo's new unit. And while Nintendo's hardware strength alone was unquestionable when compared to its fiercest competitor, the PlayStation, there was one major factor that slowly began to drag Nintendo down: the storage wars. I've touched on Nintendo's past with Sony back in our Rare Zelda games video, but here's a quick recap. Once upon a time, Sony and Nintendo worked together on a CD add-on that was supposed to release for the Super Nintendo. The CD, or compact disc, was a revolutionary new media storage device that would be used everywhere, from music to home computers to games consoles. Nintendo would undercut Sony by partnering up with Philips instead, and that deal fell through as well. But Sony went on to make their own system with media based on the CD. Meanwhile, Nintendo, perhaps out of their own arrogance against their failed CD partners, while also trying to keep the cost of their new system down, decided to go with cartridges instead. Cartridges had one solid advantage over the CD-ROM: much faster load times. The Nintendo 64 cartridge had instantaneous loading at around 5 to 50 megabytes per second, while the CDs in the Saturn and PlayStation's readers were typically running at just 200 to 300 kilobytes per second. However, storage size is where Nintendo took some huge blows. The N64 would launch with game cartridges at just 12 megabytes maximum in size, compared to the massive standard CDs were setting at around 650 megabytes each. CDs gave developers much more space to play with, giving them higher quality audio, full motion video, and it was at a much cheaper cost to produce than a cartridge as well. So take an example like Tony Hawk compared from the N64 to the PlayStation. There's no denying that the N64 load times are non-existent, while the PlayStation 1 takes some time to fire up a level. But the PlayStation version of the series supported actual video of real-life skaters throughout its menus, and it was able to support a much larger and higher quality soundtrack. Ultimately, developers began getting a little nervous with the N64's cartridge cost and limitations, and began the very first rumblings of a trend that you still hear today: Nintendo struggling to maintain third-party support. To counter these fears, we return to Spaceworld, and the 1996 debut of the 64DD, or disk drive. It was a hardware expansion for the Nintendo 64, with a disk drive and a focus on expanding the amount of storage that you can use for games. With this device, Nintendo made their stance clear. We understand the developers want more space and a cheaper format. The irony with the 64DD is that despite the name disk drive and a constant focus on discs, this machine never ran the same compact discs as the one that Nintendo was trying to compete against. Instead, they opted for a magnetic storage system very similar to the classic floppy disks that personal computers used to use, with an expanded file size of 64 megabytes per disk. This file size was still tiny compared to CD-ROMs, but it was bigger than the cartridges, and it did offer still faster loading times to CDs, as well as the ability to read and write to the discs through gameplay. Chances are very likely that if you're watching this video right now, you've never owned a Nintendo 64DD. So just what happened to this thing? At its unveiling, Nintendo seemed to have huge plans for it. The Nintendo 64 Titan, Ocarina of Time, was originally planned for the DD. It was even suggested that Zelda could have been a DD launch title. Over the years, there were so many games planned for the 64DD, but a drastic amount of them never saw life on the console. Here's just a small sample. All of these games here were planned for a Nintendo 64DD release at one point, but eventually, they were just released on regular Nintendo 64 cartridges. For most of these games, Nintendo simply released larger and larger cartridges for their games instead of using the larger 64DD size. At launch, Mario 64 used an 8 megabyte cartridge. The theoretical 64DD launch title, Ocarina of Time, ended up launching on a 32 megabyte cartridge. And at least 3 major Nintendo 64 releases, including Conker's Bad Fur Day, Resident Evil 2, and Pokémon Stadium 2, all launched on 64 megabyte cartridges. The exact same size as the so-called expanded DD discs, sort of making the whole thing useless. But perhaps most interesting are the games planned for the 64DD that never saw the light of day. Moving a bit beyond the 1996 Spaceworld unveiling of the system, here are a few cancelled DD projects. The Zelda series is one of the more curious tales. First, Ocarina of Time was going to be a DD title. Of course, it ended up as a regular cartridge game. Then, the mysterious Zelda Gaiden was going to be a DD title, but that eventually became Majora's Mask. Also a cartridge game, with a little help from the Nintendo 64 expansion pack. But a third game was also rumored between these two. Ura Zelda, literally another Zelda, that seemed to be an expansion to the original Ocarina of Time, played using both the original cartridge and the DD to play through new dungeons, scenarios, and minigames through the Legend of Zelda world. There are various beta elements hidden within Ocarina of Time's code, such as a unicorn fountain and new tunics, that many suspect would have been implemented in this disk drive expansion. Eventually, we would receive a GameCube bonus disc with the Master Quest version of Ocarina of Time, with some remixed dungeon puzzles. And while some Zelda fans consider this to be the final version of Ura Zelda, several Zelda fans believe that the original 64DD Ura Zelda would have added many more new elements than this. Beyond Ura Zelda, another interesting 64DD sequel that was cancelled is Super Mario 64 2. Miyamoto talked in interviews about how he felt the best follow-up to Super Mario 64 would be a version of the game with multiple characters. He always mentioned Luigi as a part of the experience, as well as some form of co-op. Kinda sounds like that crazy mod they ran at AGDQ. This game was never released and never even really saw screenshots. All of it existed as an idea in Miyamoto's mind, and he later admitted many years later that it never really worked out with multiplayer play. It is possible, though, that some of the multiplayer character ideas, as well as multiplayer play, ended up in the Nintendo DS version of Mario 64, which ended up having both of these concepts in one form or another. We'll take a look at another version of a sequel to Mario 64 once we hit the third part of this series. And a final cancelled 64DD game that I wanted to look at is the elusive Mother 3. No, I'm not talking about the Game Boy Advance Mother 3 that fans are still begging to be localized. I'm talking about the original Mother 3 on the Nintendo 64, also known in the West as Earthbound 64. Perhaps the largest blow Nintendo received when using the cartridge format for the Nintendo 64 was the lack of space for huge RPGs. The most famous loss was Square's Final Fantasy series, which left Nintendo after producing 6 games in the series to move to a huge CD format on the PlayStation for 7. Square even dissed the 64DD, mentioning how it would take 30 64DD discs to contain the data of their 3 CD cutscene and animation-heavy game, which just adds to why it's so crazy that we have Final Fantasy VII's Cloud in Smash Bros. Today. Shigesato Itoi wanted to make an RPG for the new Nintendo 64, but also found that the N64 cartridges were far too small for the big, colorful 3D Mother sequel that he imagined. Thus, development for Mother 3 on the 64DD was born. You can catch the tiniest, and I mean tiniest glimpse of what they had in mind for Mother 3 on the N64 from the 1996 Spaceworld demo reel, where you can catch a character resembling Ness and Ninten riding a buggy through a sandy area. for about a second. Like most Mother games, the 64DD version stumbled through development problems for years, until a playable demo finally surfaced in Spaceworld 1999. You can see a resemblance from some of these characters to the eventual Mother 3 ones, including Flint, Claus, Lucas, and Boney. The game was incredibly ambitious and wanted to have a blend of multiple different genres, with action cinematics, deep graphics, a huge world, and tons of playable characters. But in the end, Mother 3 was delayed more than the 64DD itself. By the year 2000, it was very clear that the game was hopelessly behind schedule, and it was ultimately cancelled. Growing upset with trends in 3D gaming, Itoi eventually would retool the story and characters he had for the 64DD Mother into a 2D version of Mother 3 on the Game Boy Advance. But it wasn't until 2006, nearly a decade after the original game's development, that this 2D version would release. Alright, so there's all this cool stuff that never made it to the 64DD. So what the heck would the system end up getting? Almost nothing noteworthy. There are only 10 total games for the 64DD after its Japan launch in 1999, and I can pretty much give you the entire library right now. One was an internet browser. The 64DD would end up launching with a mouse for some PC-like applications, and an internet service similar to the old St. Giga network called RandNet was included. 4 were creative tools, which were used as a primitive Photoshop, an avatar creator similar to what we'd eventually get with Mies, and a 3D polygon editor. One of the discs was used for online sharing in a printing service, which hasn't been usable in 15 years. 2 were Doshin the Giant games, a 3D god simulator game somewhat similar to the black and white games. But these were made almost entirely obsolete by a GameCube version that looks much better that released both in Japan and Europe a few years later. So what are we left with? 3 gaming titles, including a golf game. Ooh. SimCity 64, an actually solid version of SimCity, very similar to SimCity 2000, but with some added features, textures, and the ability to explore your town and residents on the ground level. And finally, by far the greatest game of the system, the F-Zero X expansion kit. This program ran alongside the N64's F-Zero X like a Mario Maker-style tool, where you could use a robust track and vehicle creator program to build and test your own F-Zero worlds. This game shows the full potential of what the 64DD could have been. If it wasn't going to get a great library of its own, it could have been used to add expansion content to already existing games with the mouse tool. But alas, the device was a complete failure by the time of its greatly delayed 1999 release, and it never saw a stateside release or support past the year 2000. What happened past its huge 1996 reveal? It seemed like a big piece of technology with big plans. Some Nintendo fans have speculated that the 64DD was planned to fail, that Nintendo knew an add-on for its console wasn't going to succeed, but that maybe being able to tell game developers and investors that they had the ability to run discs would ease the fear of their supporters. I think that the second Nintendo started using 32MB and larger cartridges was when the 64DD project was officially dead. It does get me wondering though. Nintendo always worried that a CD reader add-on would have been too expensive. But would the Nintendo 64 have been able to keep strong third-party support if it used CDs? The world will never know, but as history took its course over the next few years, the N64 sold a modest 30 million units, but compared to the massive 100 million achieved by the PlayStation, it was clear that the power of the CD format appealed to many more third-party developers. The 96 reveal of the 64DD is nothing more than an obscure blip on Nintendo's timeline, but I had a lot of fun covering it. It ultimately didn't lead to much, but the mere idea of a disc-running Nintendo 64 leads to a fun hypothetical conversation of what could have been. That's the end of part 2 for this 3-part series of Nintendo Spaceworld reveals. Our final episode will be Spaceworld 2000, in my opinion the most interesting Spaceworld event of all about the reveal of Nintendo's mysterious Project Dolphin. Thank you guys for watching today's video. If you want to check out some older technology similar to the 64DD on the Super Nintendo, check out my Rare Zelda Games video here. And the final part of this series will be available in this annotation once it's live. I'll catch you guys next time with more Nintendo content.